Attention, today this might be a conspiracy video, maybe, because in a few years we'll just say it was prophetic. Let me explain. I'll discuss the Ukrainian defense industry and rising suspicions about the USA, because the Trump administration is allegedly trying to fabricate corruption cases against Ukrainian defense companies to prevent them from winning export contracts, and so this allows them to protect their national champions like Lockheed Martin, RTX, Northrop Grumman, or General Dynamics. First, you should know that fighting corruption has been a major priority in Ukraine, especially since the Maidan Revolution. In 2014, several organizations were created, such as the National Anti-Corruption Bureau of Ukraine, known as NABU, which is an institution that was established more than 10 years ago and is strongly supported by Ukraine's Western partners, including the United States. This means that there is official cooperation with the U.S. Department of Justice, as well as with the FBI on corruption investigations, the fight against money laundering, and also the recovery of assets that may have been acquired illegally. And so all of Ukraine's allies are committed to supporting NABU, especially to defend its independence against possible political interference that could undermine its ability to conduct impartial investigations, as was feared, for example, in the summer of 2025. So NABU really conducts thorough investigations, with, for example, results in the defense industry sector, such as drone contracts, with bribes that could reach up to 30% of their value, or the creation of supposedly unnecessary foreign companies by the company Ukrbonprom to create fake jobs. So Ukrainian work is very real in anti-corruption efforts, which everyone welcomes. Except that since Donald Trump came to power, there has been a growing number of cases where NABU's investigations sometimes give the impression that it's mainly a relentless pursuit aimed at favoring American companies. It must be clear, NABU relies on foreign countries, especially for political support. Financially, part of the funds used to pay all the employees comes from abroad. And so there is really a question about to what extent NABU could be pressured to steer its investigations. And so there are suspicions that some of these investigations are actually aligned with American interests. And sometimes it feels like there is a relentless focus on certain companies, even though the evidence is sometimes extremely flimsy. Once again, if the cases are proven, there is no problem. The work needs to be carried through to the end with results that are already established. On the other hand, there are operational and industrial consequences. That means there have actually been supply disruptions in certain equipment while things were being fixed. But it also means that in some cases, investigations do not lead to results. And yet there is a slowdown in these companies' ability to innovate, and even some international partnerships cannot be achieved. And these suspicions and doubts sometimes even lead to questioning Ukraine's ability to continue producing the necessary equipment. There were even articles suggesting Ukraine might be defeated due to corruption investigations threatening certain companies. And right now, there's a company that's particularly in the spotlight. It's Firepoint. You know, I like it. I had the chance to visit it in person. I know some of its founders and technical managers. All right, let's get back to our video. And right now, there's a company that's particularly in the spotlight. It's Firepoint. And this company is incredible when you look at it from the outside because a few years ago, it didn't even exist. But today, it has notably made the FP-1 and FP-2 kamikaze drones. These are drones that can be operated from very long distances, 1,200 to 1,500 kilometers away. Some of them have instant video feedback, especially over the occupied areas in Ukraine. This gives you feedback to guide the drone right up to impact while piloting it. There's also the Flamingo cruise missile, which has attracted attention and is delivering strong results. It can carry a military payload of 1 ton over a distance of 3,000 kilometers. So just for comparison, what we gave to the Ukrainians, for example, the Scalp missiles, we reduced them so they couldn't fire beyond 300 kilometers with a military payload that was much, much smaller. And today we would be at about 6,000 FP-1 and FP-2 kamikaze drones produced each month, as well as 90 Flamingo cruise missiles. Then there are the FP-7 and FP-9, which are ballistic missiles. The goal is to fire at hundreds and hundreds of kilometers to really have the full range and all the operational, military, and offensive capability. Truly, totally sovereign from the Ukrainian point of view. And starting with the FP-7, which is this ballistic missile, the Ukrainians have established a European partnership with Thales, with MBDA, with the Germans at Deal, in order to offer a system, hold on, which is called Freya, an integrated air defense system with a specific goal. You know that the Franco-Italian SAMP-T Mamba system has better results than the Patriot in Ukraine. They say it, we boast about it, we're very proud. But today there is really a need to have more of them. And the goal of Freya is to achieve the effectiveness of the Franco-Italian Mamba Sante, but at the Ukrainian cost. A system better than the Patriot and infinitely cheaper than the Patriot. So that would be a revolution. And that's really an officially stated goal today, to be able to win the war in the field of long-range combat. You see, the Ukrainians intercept more than 95% of the Shaheds that are launched, especially with those small interceptors that I've already mentioned several times. But to handle aeroballistic missiles like the Kinzhal or Russian ballistic missiles, larger missiles are needed. And today, the Ukrainians rely on foreign support, with quantities that we are not able to provide them. However, there is a real shortage following the American operations against Iran. And so, my topic today is the special surveillance against the company Firepoint, which once again would be legitimate if there were proven cases that needed to be addressed. But for now, it looks more like a soap opera. And the different episodes, in fact, are published just at the moments that suit the Americans. First, it began last August with the official opening of 2 investigations, one into inflated subcomponent costs, which lets them sell systems at higher prices, and then about an overestimation of the number of drones that were supposedly delivered to the Ukrainian army, and which are therefore billed, even though they may not have actually been delivered. In the fall of 2025, NABU said that there might possibly be links between Firepoint and corruption networks, and especially with the controversial businessman Timur Mindich, which would mean that there might be a broader corruption system, not just the simple overbilling of missiles that are sold to the Ukrainian state. And as a reminder, Mindich is the businessman who embezzled tens of millions of dollars because he had set up a bribery system with the suppliers of the company Energoatom, which manages the Ukrainian nuclear power plants. And so, once sanctions had been imposed against him, he managed to flee abroad. But really, we're talking about someone who actually embezzled millions and millions of dollars, and who fled. And the president of Firepoint, whom I had the chance to meet, said in November 2025 that Mindich had indeed tried to take over the company Firepoint. But they managed to stop him, that he had refused to let him buy shares, and that they made sure to stay away from this shady character. So, from their point of view, they don't control Firepoint. They don't own any Firepoint shares. So they stay away from this matter. But at the end of April, beginning of May, there are new audio recordings that are directly related to these bribery cases in the nuclear energy sector. These are made public. And in some of them, Mindich mentions Firepoint. He talks about the company's financing and the possible sale of part of the company to foreign investors. And in the way he expresses himself, it gives the impression that he is almost a personal beneficiary of the company. But what's also important is the timing. These revelations were published on the very morning of 2 very important meetings for Firepoint. The first one is to be able to start producing Flamingo cruise missiles locally in Denmark. What happened is that the signing of this partnership was postponed until the whole matter was clarified. That is, until Firepoint was cleared. Potentially months, even years of delay based on mere suspicion for now. The second problem is Freya, the air defense system. This air defense system was also supposed to have an agreement signed between all the parties involved in the coming days. And that too has been postponed with no signing date set. Yet, when we ask ourselves what can be blamed on Firepoint, it's still things that are easy to verify. If we look, for example, at the recordings related to Firepoint in the Mindich tape, these recordings aren't even a problem. First, because they date back to July 2025, so at a time when Mindich still thought he might be able to take control of the Firepoint company. Next, it should be emphasized that nothing new is being criticized. It talks about Fairpoint's contracts with the state, the company's valuation, difficulties in finding labor, or the possible entry of foreign shareholders. And indeed, in the meantime, the company from the United Arab Emirates, Edge, has made public its intention to increase its stake in Fairpoint to take 25% of the company's capital for an amount of $760 million. Regarding possible overbilling, subcomponent costs, or missiles built but not delivered, if there's a difference between the actual missiles Ukraine fired and what they billed for, Ukrainians can track the missiles they've sent to Russia, so we know how much they should have billed and can account for any differences. On the issue of overbilling, it's also been more than 6 months now since the investigations were launched. The Firepoint missile costs $55,000. The FP1 is so cheap compared to everything else we could make here. It's 3 times cheaper than the Ludi, which has another system, which is very well known, which is very good, which is certainly more efficient, more technical. Knowing that more than half of the destruction that has occurred on Russian territory was caused by Firepoint. So a company that sells systems 3 times cheaper than the others, effective, and if overbilling exists, it should have already been identified, But in any case, today it's like a sword of Damocles hanging over our heads. The leaders and the overall organization of the Firepoint company, which weighs on its operational capacity and its ability to form partnerships abroad. And who does this benefit? Certainly not Ukraine. Ukraine needs to get its missiles as quickly as possible and needs these agreements. Certainly not Europe, which could have an autonomous, sovereign industrial capacity to stop depending on the Americans, since the Germans and others don't want to buy French. That would enable an efficient, affordable European system. That obviously benefits Russia, since Ukrainian air defense will be less effective. And it benefits the United States, who can continue to flood the world with their Patriot systems, which are less effective and more expensive than their competitors. And what do we learn a week later on May 8th? The United States signed an arms contract with the Gulf countries for, hold on, $28.8 billion worth of defense equipment. That's triple the expected amount for this contract. Also, among the published information, there are $4 billion worth of Patriot systems for Qatar and $2.5 billion for an integrated air defense and command system for Kuwait, as well as APKWS laser-guided rockets, which are used to intercept drones in particular. With $1 billion for Qatar, $148 million for the United Arab Emirates, and all of that. This is in addition to the $9 billion that Saudi Arabia signed to purchase Patriot systems at the beginning of the year. So we're really talking about tens and tens of billions in contracts that are coming in just as the competing system to the Patriot, which is cheaper and more effective, can no longer go through, or at least there's uncertainty about the timeline. By the way, did you notice which Gulf country hasn't bought Patriots? It's the United Arab Emirates. Why? For two reasons. First, they've entered a partnership with Israel, which could be more reliable and affordable than the United States. So there are Israeli air defense systems that will start protecting Israel while waiting for Freya, a system that would be both European and Emirati, technically European, but also funded by the Emirates. And the Americans are in a very complicated situation since they see the Ukrainians taking market share from them. With strategic partnerships in the field of air defense that have been established between Saudi Arabia and Ukraine, the Emirates and Ukraine, Qatar and Ukraine, since they are the only ones who are able to defend them against the Iranian Shahed drones. And so they are afraid that the Ukrainians will also gain a foothold in the heavy air defense segment, the Patriot, which is the most profitable one. So today, once again, there is no proof. But would you really be surprised if in a few years we learned that the United States did in fact manipulate the NABU in order to undermine the Ukrainian and European ability to offer an alternative? Would this be the first time? In the 1990s, for instance, the United States conveniently started an anti-corruption procedure against the French company Thomson CSF at the time of the contract negotiations for the sale of CVOM radars to Brazil, and the accusations were eventually dropped in the meantime. But the American company Raytheon had already won the contract. Another example is what happened in the United States itself in 2010, the Chacho case, when the FBI arrested 22 executives from defense companies during a defense industry trade show in Las Vegas because they were accused of corruption. Except that in reality, it was later proven that the FBI agents themselves had orchestrated and incited the corruption, which led to the charges being dropped in 2012. Except that in the meantime, some of these companies, of course, had lost their contracts and some had gone out of business. You're talking about Alstom, what happened in 2014, the corruption charges against this French company, the imprisonment without trial of an executive from the company, even putting pressure on them to sell under extremely favorable conditions to Alstom's direct competitors. For the energy division to General Electric, you want to talk about Germany with Siemens, which had to pay a record fine of $800 million. This forced the company to launch a massive restructuring, which conveniently allowed American companies like Honeywell to gain an advantage in certain markets where Siemens used to dominate. Or maybe you want to talk about the Brazilian oil company Petrobras, which was convicted in 2018, allowing American majors like Exxon and Chevron to obtain operating licenses that were once reserved for Brazilian national champions. In short, once again, today we don't have any proof, but the suspicions are there, and they're getting more and more serious. That doesn't mean NABU is corrupt. That is, it doesn't mean that NABU shouldn't continue to do its impartial work, just with real investigations. But it does mean that letting doubt linger for years and years to prevent these companies from developing, from going international, from raising funds, from getting money to grow faster, and from making industrial partnerships that would benefit us too, because we would have better air defense, for less money, more effective, taking market share from the Americans. Well, maybe those are things we'll find out in a few years. I just hope that we'll be able to free ourselves from the United States because every time we make a contract in dollars, American law applies. So maybe we should also ask ourselves that question. The extraterritoriality of American law, the problem with the dollar, and our ability to accept the fact that we want to be a sovereign, independent power tomorrow without the United States, because these kinds of problems will continue to exist as long as the Americans consider us as lackeys. There you go. Hope you enjoyed it. See you soon.